And now we're back, and this is the 10th lesson. This is really the last lesson that I had on the chart as far as organized material. But I believe there's still going to be 3 more weeks in the quarter we'll be together. So at that point, I'll continue to address. Certainly, I'll have opportunity for some Q&A. And there's plenty of other areas that we've just barely touched on that we can touch on. We may get into some defenses against atheism or other religions who would criticize the idea of the resurrection of Christ, since it's one of the most demonstrable facts of history, even more so than many things that are not miraculous, that people accept as truth. So we may do some of that. We'll see how it goes. But this is the last scheduled one from your original chart, and then we'll be able to have 3 more weeks after that. So we're going to talk today on the subject of atheists and agnostics. Now, at Masters Baptist College, I teach a class on Christian denominations. That was really the first, maybe 4 or 5 of the lessons that we had in this class. So that's taking 18 hours of material and kind of squishing it down, obviously. I also teach a class on comparative religion, which, again, is taking that material and putting it into those last 5 weeks. And then today is atheists and agnostics, and I have a whole week just on the subject of atheism and faith. So now we've been compressing things a lot. I'm going to try to compress quite a bit. And so I'm really only going to hit on a very specific slice of the discussion of atheism and agnosticism. Some of the things that I cover in that class regarding the validity of faith, worldviews, those things go across not just atheism, but really all viewpoints. And even some of these can be helpful, even if you just want to strengthen your own faith, to realize the atheist arguments are very shallow and the Christian arguments are very strong. But I may bring some of that other atheism material in and cover it maybe even next week. We'll see how things go. What we're really going to do is we're going to discuss 2 separate things relating to the arguments of atheists and agnostics. And we're going to present positive arguments for the existence of God, also address some of the responses that are made by atheists against these arguments, and then obviously give our response to their challenges. And then we're going to look at 2 of the major atheist arguments, or really one's an extremely major argument, the first one there, and the second one's kind of something that has been thrown around and not really too serious of an argument, but for whatever reason, sometimes unserious arguments convince people, so I always like to bring it up. So we're going to discuss a couple of those arguments that an atheist would throw at us, and then discuss why these are not challenges that cannot be overcome. So maybe you're familiar with some of these. Certainly, a couple of these are, even if you didn't know the title, you would recognize kind of the principle from them. But we're going to start by talking about a positive argument for the existence of God, which is called the cosmological argument. And right here off the sheet, it says, the cosmological argument says that things happen for a reason. Any event occurs because of something that caused it. There must be some originating cause that itself was uncaused. There must be an unmoved mover. This uncaused cause is God. So looking to the right, I've laid it out in an outline here. So the cosmological argument here, put in another way, number 1, things exist. I think that's a relatively, you would say, a point that is accepted by all, though there are some people who would even challenge this point. Existentialists, etc., may say, well, no, it's all an illusion, or maybe even a Buddhist viewpoint. But if we can get at least this far and have some common ground, I think we can with most atheists. You'll notice one thing. I'll just throw this out right here. Atheism, a lot of times filled with a bunch of intellectuals, you're less likely to find people who challenge the idea of like there is nothing that's absolute. Now they would deny certain things we claim to be absolute, but they say no, there's real absolutes. They won't be so much existentialists. They like logic. They always try to claim your logic is not right, but they do generally, from what I've experienced, they like to go through and arrange things. And because of this, and also because of other reasons, such as the fact that atheism has been persecuted, they end up thinking out even politics. You'll find they're normally pretty educated on those things. And so some of these arguments, they're useful in that sense, to at least be able to demonstrate that you do have a response to the logic they're going to try to put out there, even though I will admit that you're not going to really be able to just win a logical argument and bring them to Jesus Christ, but you do need to demonstrate that you're not just, you're just believing that because you were born that way, that you were born into a Christian family, so you're a Christian. So, us atheists, we're really smart. You Christians just believe in fairies. Well, if you can show them that there's a little bit more to the Christian side, that often will appeal to their sense of reason. All right, let's look back at the cosmological argument. Number one, things exist. Number two, it is possible for those things to not exist. Number three, whatever has the possibility of non-existence, yet exists, has been caused to exist. And as part of this point, something cannot bring itself into existence, since it must exist to bring itself into existence, which is illogical. Number four, there cannot be an infinite number of causes to bring something into existence. An infinite regression of causes ultimately has no initial cause, which means there is no cause of existence. Since the universe exists, it must have a cause. Number five, therefore, there must be an uncaused cause of all things. Number six, the uncaused cause must be God. Now, if you're extremely logical thinking, you may have been extremely happy all the way through 1 through 4, but you may think, boy, 5 and 6 seem kind of like a cop-out, all right? And we'll discuss why that's not the case. But back on the left-hand side, critics of the cosmological argument ask, who created God? Now, generally, if somebody's going to posit this original question, the cosmological argument, you're not going to see somebody walk up to an atheist and give a 6-point outline, right? They'll say, something to the extent of there needs to be something that created everything because things don't come out of nowhere. And God did that, right? That would be the main way that they would kind of posit the cosmological argument. And that's generally when the atheist responds, all right, well then, who created God? Right? Because you can even imagine from a child's perspective, where did this come from? Well, that came from this. Where did that come from? That came from this, and all the way back, and then eventually, and you ultimately get back to the question, well, then God. But then it seems like there's one more question to ask at that point, right? Well, then where did God come from? And so that is the atheist question. Now, the answer is that uncaused existence is possible, but only of things outside of time and not subject to decay. Let's discuss why caused existence generally needs to be possible. Could the universe have existed forever? That was a viewpoint for a long time, the view of the eternality of matter. But now science tells us that matter cannot exist forever because there is a slow decay of all matter. Eventually it just ends up as heat. Heat dissipates, and they posit that if the world is going to go on forever, eventually at some point everything's just going to level out, kind of like you leave a cup of ice in a room. Eventually it's just going to assume the temperature of the room. Well, the whole universe is heading that way. Things are going to level out. We're going to reach a point where everything is just entirely the same temperature, and that's the heat death of the universe, and no more energy remains for anything to happen ever again. That's the claim that would be made if we live for enough billions of years longer. Eventually the heat death of the universe will take place. So if matter was eternal, if really the universe has always existed, heat death would have happened long ago because we'd already ran out of matter. If there's an eternity in the past and yet we have something that runs out over time, that is heat, then eternality of matter is not a legitimate viewpoint. And so generally, even an atheist or an evolutionist or a scientist who's just a rationalist, they don't hold to the viewpoint of the eternality of matter because they realize they accept this argument. Now, there's also spontaneous generation. In other words, everything just came out of absolutely nothing. And generally, this is, although it would be rejected by many skeptics as saying that the Big Bang Theory is this, they'd say, no, it didn't come out of nothing. The reality is there's no option other than that. If nothing blew up and everything was formed, that really is a form of spontaneous generation. The problem with spontaneous generation is that it's something that basically it is posited because there is no evidence for it. There's no evidence to prove your point, so you just say it just happened out of nowhere. And it's also never been shown to happen anywhere within our world. People thought for a long time, maggots that appear on meat, those are spontaneously generated. They couldn't figure out what happened. And eventually people realized, oh, no, that's not spontaneous generation. A guy decided to actually enclose some meat, put something over it, and it rotted, but it didn't have maggots, and then they finally realized that it's just flies being born, and so they figured that out. It's not really spontaneous generation. And so that also is a failing viewpoint. So then what about the question, who created God? Think of things that are in the universe. Matter, for example. Matter decays. Matter exists in a physical plane, and so it cannot just be in no position. It cannot We cannot think of it as something that could just appear out of nowhere because it has a value to it. But what about something spiritual? Does the spirit decay? Our bodies decay, but does the spirit, does the soul decay? Is it made of matter? Is there a problem with the spirit existing an infinite amount of time? Would it eventually decay into nothing? And this is the point, that things that have a beginning, things that are a caused existence and require it, that is matter itself and energy, they require a caused existence, they cannot exist eternally. But something that is not subject to decay, something that could in fact exist outside of time, outside of space, and exist forever, could be an uncaused cause, and that cause is God. Now, there's several things that are important. If you're going to hold that viewpoint, you need to be consistent. There are some people who say that when God, that we're made in the image of God, that means that our shape is in the image of God. That is, God is basically kind of like a spiritual man. All right, and I don't believe this is the case. The Bible tells us that we're made in the image of God, but that speaks a lot more to the fact that we are thinking, believing, understanding, intelligent creatures that He made He made us in His image in that way. It's silly to think of God as somebody with arms and legs, although the Bible anthropomorphizes Him sometimes and says, that He sees and looks, but it's just kind of explaining Him in ways we can understand. Because what would be the point of God having legs? Legs are designed to walk on this earth. God gave us legs, He gave us arms to interact with this world, etc. Now, there's the problem with holding the idea that God Himself really does have a shape, because the idea of a shape of God, that God is like a man, that's a created viewpoint. You would imagine, well, if man needs to be created in this shape, and yet God inherently has this shape, then it seems like somebody did need to create God, because that's a created concept, the idea of hands and arms, etc. But if it's just a spirit, we understand God is the most complex and comprehensible being, but at its core, the idea of just a spirit is one of the most simple things to understand. That the idea that a spirit, all-powerful spirit, could exist forever, and God is a spirit, that is something that can be understood in the viewpoint of not having to been created. But if God has these specific creatable parts, like a shape of a body or things like that, then there is a problem. And this is why some cults actually fail in this area, because they give God, an eternal body, or Jesus Christ an eternal body, and we understand that not to be the case. So the cosmological argument basically will go down to the uncaused cause must be God. Now you could say, well, no, I think the uncaused cause was an alien. Well, does the alien have a shape? Yep, okay, so he needs a creator too. And they may say, no, the alien doesn't have a shape. Okay. So you think the uncaused cause is an alien, the alien doesn't have a shape. Is the alien visible or invisible? Well, he's visible. Well, okay, if he's a visible matter, then that means that it would need a creator. Okay, no, he's invisible. Okay. And eventually, if you boil it down and they argue with it, you just get down to the fact that, okay, you're calling it an alien, but I'm just going to call it God, because that's all that you've left us with. Somebody actually argued this. They said, I think a computer created everything. And basically, you argue against this. Okay, is it a visible computer made of parts? And eventually they realize they can't say that it was made of parts, and so you realize when you argue down the path long enough, they just reduce it down to being God again. Really the only uncaused thing that can exist is God. Any other argument, if you try to make it the original cause, fails to work. And so that's the point of the cosmological argument. Let's move on to the teleological argument. The teleological argument is known as the argument from design. The world exhibits characteristics of design, and so requires a designer. Now, modern science has claimed to answer the teleological argument through the theory of evolution. This obviously should be challenged, but the teleological argument still works without entering this debate. Now, let's address this first and most common form of the teleological argument first. And really, if you're going to argue with an atheist, just for the point of being able to get anywhere, I would recommend using what we'll discuss in just a little bit as the better form of the teleological argument, and not this one. So generally when people say things, they say, well, the world exhibits design, the heavens declare the glory of God, look at the human eye, look at the ear, etc. And I think this is a great argument. I really think it's impenetrable. Evolution does not, in the long run, work to explain even how created beings as ourselves work. It can't explain the existence of the soul. But when you get into that argument that you've just turned down the argument of is evolution true or not? And that's pretty much all you're going to discuss the rest of the time that you're there. And whoever has studied the issue more and has some little things that the other person hasn't really looked into is going to kind of have the upper hand, regardless of what the truth is. So yes, it's a great argument, and I'm glad there's organizations out there still fighting on this front. But if you're actually talking to an atheist and you want to show them that there's some logic and reasoning and understanding behind your view and your belief in God, and you want to do that through the use of philosophical arguments, which is not the only way to do this, by the way, but some of the ones we're discussing today, going down that path is going to just inevitably lead you into a thing on evolution. So there is a different way to discuss it. A version of the teleological argument called the fine-tuning argument argues that universal constants like the speed of light and the precision of the force of gravity and the strong and weak nuclear forces seem fine-tuned to make the existence of life and matter possible. So what does this mean? Well, evolution can explain living creatures, presumably, certainly in the viewpoint of an evolutionist, can explain living creatures turning into other living creatures, and so all living things have eventually formed out of a single-celled organism, etc. But what about things like gravity? Can gravity evolve? And yet, if gravity was very much stronger or very much weaker, human life would be impossible. What about the electromagnetic force? It's a very, very precise number. And if the electromagnetic force was a little bit different, then cells would not be able to remain connected together. You would have many things that would just be incompatible with life. What about these strong and weak nuclear forces? All of these things, if they were tweaked just a bit, life would not be possible. Even the Big Bang, when they talk about that, the Big Bang couldn't have happened under conditions where these forces were different. So even that falls apart. So why is it that all of these constants are so finely tuned? If you imagine all the variations they could be, it seems like somebody's, the strong nuclear force, weak nuclear force, gravity, electromagnetism, all of these things, and there's actually more than a couple hundred of these various things that could be tweaked in that way. They're all finely tuned in order to make life possible. And these are not things that evolve. These are just constants. We don't know why they're exactly this way. It seems like they've been set. We could imagine a world. In fact, if you've played any video games, you've probably seen worlds where the gravity has been, flipped upside down, or it's less or it's more. And obviously, even other places within the universe, you can get in gravitational wells. But the gravitational force is a constant here in this universe. And it's been set somehow, and nobody knows how. Except we do know one thing, that it's very precisely made in such a way that life can exist in this world. Now, how's an atheist going to respond to this? And in fact, many of them, like the late Christopher Hitchens said, he said that was the strongest argument that he'd ever seen, was the fine-tuning argument. He said, it was very difficult to overcome. And there's really only one big argument that they try to use against the fine-tuning argument, which is the multiverse theory. Multiverse theory says we are just one of an infinite number of universes, or at least a very high number of universes, millions and millions of them. And there's somewhere out there, there's basically some kind of universe-generating machine just spitting out universes, and they all have random constants, and we've just happened, lucky us, to land in the universe where these constants have been, after an infinite number of universes, you'd expect there's going to be some universe somewhere where everything's just aligned and life is possible. But, there's millions and billions of universes out there where life isn't possible because they weren't finely tuned right. Now, there's a few problems with this. One of them is that we've never discovered any other universe, or really, the theory itself positing a separate universe is one that sets itself up to not be discoverable. If the universe is really separate and in some entirely different dimension, it's non-disprovable. We can't even formulate a test to see if it's true or not, because other universes are outside of something that we can go and try to find. And so there's one problem. It's another thing that's just built as a rescue machine to help to save them from the problem that has been presented to them. Another problem is this universe-generating machine that's spitting out universes. Sounds like something that needs a designer, in my opinion. It sounds pretty complex, something making universes. And so you still have that problem, what's causing these universes to come into existence. But you see that it's a relatively ridiculous response because it's such a high barrier for them to overcome. The teleological argument, especially the form of the fine-tuning argument, is a very strong argument for the existence of God. And then the moral argument. And the moral argument, when improperly understood, often leads to a problem for a Christian or for a theist. Generally, if you hear somebody try to make some kind of a moral argument without having studied it out against an atheist, to say, hey, if you aren't a Christian, if you are an atheist, then you're probably a pretty immoral person. You can do whatever you want, and so you're not going to. We don't want to be that kind of a person, so we're going to believe in God. That's not a very good argument. Number one, an argument that you just want to believe something because it makes you a better person doesn't actually lead you toward finding the truth. There are a lot of people who pick their religion based on, I think this religion's more kind or whatever. But the fact is, the true religion is independent of what's more kind or what's not kind. The truth depends on reality. And reality may be kind, it may be unkind, it may be fun, it may not be fun, it may have bad news. You just have to find what the truth is, right? So the moral argument doesn't make that kind of a claim. It doesn't even claim that an atheist necessarily is going to be any less moral than a Christian. But here's how it goes. The moral argument claims that there are no standards for right and wrong without God. Since many atheists are unwilling to admit certain things like robbery, rape, or murder are just cultural standards, it seems like there is a divine set of moral law, and therefore a divine lawgiver who has written this moral law in our hearts. Dostoevsky said, if there is no God, then everything is permissible. So here's how it goes. A person basically says, okay, why is it that we believe that murder is wrong? Do you could posit to the atheist, believe that murder is always and everywhere wrong? Now, there are a few atheists who nowadays will say, they basically give nothing up. They would say, no, everything is fine. It's just cultural standards that have led to us saying murder is wrong. Anything is permissible if the cultural conditions are right. But a lot of people don't want to give that up because they realize that it really doesn't make sense. It doesn't match with what we understand personally. Every person has some sense of moral reality that they understand, at least until they get to a point where they've discarded it. And so they would try to say, no, murder really is wrong. Well, why? Why is murder wrong? Why is rape wrong? Why is it wrong to take something that doesn't belong to you? Why are any of these things wrong? And so they've tried at various times to posit some kind of set of rules that make it why something's wrong. But it seems that you ultimately always can get back to that same question, well, why is that wrong? Well, why is that wrong? And you have to get back to the point where somebody said so. And so the moral argument says God said so, and because God is the ultimate uncaused cause, the creator, God has the right to say so, that's why it's wrong. I mean, he's even built us, so he certainly can build us in such a way that we understand certain things to be wrong. It makes a lot of sense. But if there is no creator, then why is it that certain things are wrong? There's some atheists who try to say, basically, that which brings the greatest happiness to the greatest number of people is morally right, and the things that harm that taking place, those are morally wrong. That's actual morality. And then the question to them is, says who? That's what you think. You just made up a set of morality, and you say that's the absolute morality, but you say so, I say not. I say whatever makes me happy is morally right. And if that includes killing lots of people off and enslaving people, then that's morally right. Now, you have your set of morality, I have mine. Now demonstrate to me in some logical way why yours is right and mine is wrong. Unless you have somebody to arbitrate that decision, like God, you have no way to determine which morality really is right or which one's wrong. So there is no way that you can argue that there is a real morality, a true, absolute set of right and wrong without the existence of God. As you see, the moral argument doesn't claim that atheists are immoral. That is, an atheist himself might think that murder is wrong, but he's just being inconsistent because he has no reason within his own framework of believing to claim it's wrong. He says murder's wrong, but really, if there is no God, if there is nobody who said it's wrong, if nobody else knows and you killing somebody or stealing from them benefits you or maybe sets you up better in the evolutionary gene pool, that's what's right for you, and just go ahead and do it, and eat, drink, and be merry, and have as much fun as you want right now, because ultimately it's all going to disappear at the end of your life when you turn to nothing, right? So have a good time. That's really the way atheists should believe. It doesn't say that they will. Many atheists will try to live a very moral life, but they have no reason to do so from their own worldview. And responses to this include, some claim nothing's inherently immoral. Richard Dawkins is one of these, but it leads to them having basically a viewpoint that they aren't able to get very many people to jump on the bandwagon with. Nothing's immoral. So it is essentially, and really this is the consistent atheist argument. It should be the one they would state, because if atheism were to be true, nothing would be immoral. It makes sense. That's what Dostoevsky's quote here says. But it just seems so wrong for them to admit it. Hey, since God doesn't exist, if behind your back I find an opportunity to do things that everybody else would consider immoral, they're not really immoral, and so I'm just going to do it. And this is the world we'd be left with if there is no true morality. Others claim, without evidence, some moral standard that doesn't include God, such as it is immoral to violate the bodily rights or personal freedoms of another person. And again, the question there would just be, says who? So now let's move on and address a few arguments against the existence of God. And this one here is, the problem of evil is absolutely the strongest, most difficult, serious argument against the existence of God, and should be taken seriously. And the interesting thing about the problem of evil is it's not just a problem posited by atheists, right? It's obviously a question that's on the mind of a lot of Christians as well. Why is there evil in this world? Why do bad things happen to good people, etc.? There's a lot of different ways it shows up. If God exists, why is there, I have the wrong there on there, I'm pretty upset about that, T-H-E-R-E, why is there so much evil in this world? After all, if God is all loving and all powerful, he could choose to do away with all evil. So one way that this may be presented by an atheist is in the same kind of a layout format that we use for the cosmological argument. Their first point may be, okay, God is all-powerful. And number two, God is all-benevolent or all good. And number three, God is the creator of all things. And number four, God, as being all-benevolent and all-powerful, is capable of making a world in which no evil exists. And number five, God being capable of making a world in which no evil exists, and choosing to not make a world in which all evil exists, but to make one in which evil does exist or has the possibility of existing, is not being all benevolent or all loving. Therefore, logical contradiction, God does not exist. That may be the way that they would present it. So God could have made a world in which everything was just great and happy, but he let evil into it, and so there's a problem then with our viewpoint of God being either all loving or all powerful. And there's a couple ways this argument presents itself that I've listed here below. There's two parts: natural evil and moral evil. So there's moral evil. People murder, people steal, etc. These things are viewed as being moral evils. God could prevent those moral evils, but sometimes he doesn't. Or natural evil. What about earthquakes that kill lots of people? What about cancer? These are things that aren't really triggered by an individual person, but it seems like then they're on God. And so this is the way the problem of evil is presented. And there are several appropriate and strong Christian responses to this. And the most important argument is understanding even biblically what God has said about himself and his intentions in creation. He talks about how he created man. He created man, number one, in his image. And as I've stated before, I believe part of this is man is a thinking, understanding, believing, loving creature that can do all of these things. And he has stated that he's created man for his own pleasure. And God also states that he receives glory when people come to him by faith. And so God wants to have a personal relationship with each one of us. And so if God wanted to, God could have just made us automatons, could have made us robots, machines that just love him. But I think we all realize that that doesn't really seem like love if you've just built a machine to love you. If I build a robot to send me a text message every day and say, I love you, you'd say, you just kind of made that happen, right? That's not real love. You need to somehow make something with some free will Because if it loves you when it has the choice to not love you, that's when you can see there's some real love there, as opposed to something just forced to love. Now, God being all-powerful doesn't mean that he can do things that are impossible in the sense that, like, making a square circle. Now, some may argue there's a couple of viewpoints of a person being all-powerful. They say, no, God can make a square circle, or God can make purple-green, things like this. But it is impossible for God to make a world, it's certainly in my viewpoint, where people do not have free will, and yet they can still choose to love God, and that love would be legitimate. I suppose I would be contradicting the Calvinists in that way. They would say, God's forced everything on us, but somehow it's still legitimate. I don't believe that's correct. But because of that, God has made a world in which it is possible for people to not love him. It is possible for people to not follow him. He put a tree in a garden, and he said, he didn't say, don't eat of it, and also I have built into you a way so that you can never possibly eat of it, because obviously they did eat of it. And God didn't cause them to eat of it. They made that choice of their own free will. And then he continued to present options as history went on and time went on, giving them opportunities to turn back to him. But if God wanted to create a world in which there was no possibility of evil, he would have created a world in which there was no possibility of true love, no possibility of people actually coming to know him by choice. And so God made the world for a purpose, and because of that, evil was possible. But note, he didn't create the evil itself. He created the possibility of it. He created free will. So what has really caused the evil in this world? Is it God, or is it us? God created us for a specific purpose, a specific thing he wanted us to do, and we disobeyed him, and we have brought evil into this world. Now you may say, well, that explains the moral evil, but what about the natural evil? Well, if you go back into Genesis 3, you'll find that a specific time when man chose to disobey God, that is when natural evil entered into the world. No longer is it going to be easy for you in the garden. Thorns and thistles are going to come forth. Other things are going to happen. As part of the curse, God introduces natural evil in this world as well. And so we find that both natural evil is a response to moral evil, and moral evil as something that is brought out because of mankind and not because of God. And so we find these are some explanations. Now there's a few other explanations that are very strong in answering the problem of evil. One of them is God being all-powerful is in a much better vantage point than we are to determine when something is really better than not. What do we mean by this? Well, there's been people who have had a very hard time over the fact that their young child, maybe young daughter, contracts cancer, and they watch that child wither away in a hospital and die. And they say, what possible good reason could God have to allow something like this to happen? Why did God not create a world in which this didn't happen? And our answer to that is that God is in a much better vantage point to see what's happening. Imagine this morning after I leave and I get in my van and I drive down the interstate, that suddenly I decide that my life isn't interesting enough, and so I just take the steering wheel and I turn it sideways and I plow into the side of another car, and we're going 65 on the interstate, and so a few more cars pile up, a few people die, a bunch more people are delayed as their cars are down the interstate behind me. As a result of that, there'll be a few families who are going to have a very different life tomorrow, and there's going to be a few people who are going to get home late, probably dozens, hundreds of people who are going to have their life slightly altered because they got stopped on the interstate there. Some people are going to come from out of state to attend some funerals. As a result of those people coming out of state, they won't show up to work, and so their work will take place a little bit slower in their home cities. As a result, that file won't be sent, that email won't be sent. The world will change, and in a matter of just a few days, this butterfly effect of things happening just because of one action that I took here in Fargo, North Dakota, will spread across the globe. And in 20 years, the world will be an entirely different place than it would have been had I not made that decision. My single decision will make people die, people survive, people who would have gotten a car wreck at this intersection didn't show up at that intersection, and so they live on for many more years. It's a butterfly effect, the smallest things that we do. affect the world in ways we never would have thought possible. But there is one person who does know how small changes in this world will make other things happen. God, being all-wise and all-knowing, knows that if he makes a small tweak in the universe here, that this will happen over here. And so perhaps when we say, how could God have let that young girl die of cancer? God said, you see this small evil here, but over here, 30 more people got saved. Over here, 4 people survived because of that small tweak in the universe, and really we're in no position as people to see this before heaven, how these small tweaks that God may make, or things that we think are evil that he allows to happen, will turn out for good. And the Bible does tell us that God himself is the one working all things together for good to those that love him, right? And so we need to trust that God has an answer to the problem of evil, even if we don't see the initial results to each individual evil in our life taking place in some way that we can understand in the here and now. And those are some pretty strong arguments. Obviously, just viewpoints of perspective as well. I think it's a horrible, evil thing that child dies of cancer. And as a result, what happens? A 2-year-old young girl maybe would have lived maybe to 80. Let's say she lived to 80. So 78 years of earthly life less. That's the evil I see. And God sees, in his perspective, that 78 years just being a portion that continues through eternity. Because when that girl dies, she enters eternity, and eternity stretches forever and ever. It goes, if this is the scale of the 78 years, it goes, and it goes across the interstate, and it goes, and it goes, and it goes, and it goes all the way into Canada, and it crosses, it's infinite. The time frame that a person can live in heaven after a seemingly awful life on this earth will wipe away all tears just in that concept. The glory which shall be revealed in us is not something that is even worthy to be compared with the sufferings of this present life. Paul told us, and it makes sense, the present life can be so evil, but when it's covered with a billion years of glory, is it really that big of a problem of evil? And so that the view of perspective, which we, again, can't properly see compared to God, makes the problem of evil disappear in comparison. Another one is that God is not simply kind, but God is good. If you're simply kind to somebody, you're kind when your neighbor comes over and says, hey, can you watch my kids for an evening? And so you watch their kids for an evening, and the neighbor's kid disbehaves, and you're just kind to them, right? But your kid disobeys, and you're not just kind to your kid, you have a longer perspective. And so there may be a spanking, there may be some more discipline. You're just kind to your neighbor's kids, but you have a longer viewpoint and perspective for your own kids, and so you're going to be objectively good, which means in the moment you may not seem so kind, but it's for their ultimate good. And so God allows things into our lives that we say, that's not very kind of you, God, but God is trying to form a person. And he could never form a person that would be able to handle and understand and deal with the great problems of this world if there were no problems against which they would have to face them. He could not help somebody become brave if there was not some danger. How could somebody be valiant if there was not something to be valiant against? How could you learn to stand up against evil if there was no evil against which to stand up? And so God is more than simply kind to his children. He's also objectively good. And so that is the problem of evil, and in brief, a few of the ways that we can respond to it. We have just a few more minutes, so let's cover the question, turning to perhaps a more jovial point of the paradox of the stone. This is the one that, as soon as the kid hears for the first time, they're like, whoa, what a problem. And some people think it's still a problem, but it really is demonstrably not that big of a problem. Can God create a stone so heavy that he cannot lift it? All right, the age-old question. And the question is built in the same way, if you didn't notice, as, have you stopped beating your wife? That is, a rigged question to which either response brings a wrong answer. Have you noticed the question, have you stopped beating your wife? Well, if you say yes, that means you did in the past, and if you say no, it means you're still doing it now. That is a question to which you cannot answer correctly. But also this one is the same thing. There's a few different ways that we can answer it. First, let's touch on what I mentioned, the viewpoints of omnipotence. What does it mean to be all-powerful? Well, there's two viewpoints of omnipotence. Either all-powerful means God can do everything that's logically possible and not things that are not logically possible, or God can do everything that is logically possible, and he can also do things that are logically impossible. If God can only do things that are logically possible, God cannot make a stone so heavy that he cannot lift it, because it is logically impossible for there to be both an immovable object and an all-powerful force in the same universe. So God can't create such a stone because it's just an impossible thing to do, and that does not cause a problem to God's omnipotence. So no problem there. If God can also do everything that is logically possible and things that are logically impossible, God can make a rock so big that he cannot lift it, and then he can lift it. And you say that's logically impossible, and I said yes, but we already agreed God can do things that are logically impossible. So either viewpoint of omnipotence leads to this question falling apart. But really, to better understand the way this question works and why this question does not make a whole lot of sense, is to view the idea of the weight of a stone for what it really means to God. Realize, again, God is not a man. God is an all-powerful spirit. So when you say, can God create a rock so heavy, heaviness is not a quality that is a challenge to God. In other words, the lightest thimble is just as much a challenge to God as lifting the entire world, because neither of them are at all a challenge to God. It's not even slightly more of a challenge to lift the whole world. So really to say, can God create a rock so heavy he can't lift it, is to pick an arbitrary thing that is not challenging to God and try to make it so bad. So it's essentially asking the same thing as, can God create a rock so purple that he cannot lift it? Can he make a rock so intelligent that he cannot lift it, right? It's just an arbitrary quality that's really not limiting to God, and you're trying to say, can God make it so this quality that he cannot lift it? And so essentially, there are two questions here. The first question is, can God create a rock so heavy? How heavy that rock is, you could put any number on it. Can he make it such and such heavy? And put any number you want in there. And the second question is, can he lift it? And the answer to both questions is yes. God can create the rock so heavy, and he also can lift it. The original question has already answered the second part of the question with no. They've said, can God create the rock so heavy? That's open to our question. And they've already answered the second question, can he lift it? They already answered that with no. That's a wrong answer. The correct answer is yes. Now, one other thing to answer this seemingly a silly question is to realize that God can put limits on his omnipotence. If God wants to limit himself in a certain way, he sure can. So if God wanted to, in reality, create a rock so heavy and then say, not by nature of the fact that the rock is so heavy that it's just impossible to lift it, but then declare he would never lift it, sure, God could do that. In fact, he's already put limits. He said, God created a world, and then he said, I'll never flood it. And so God now has limited his omnipotence to never do another global flood upon this world. Now, he's reserved the power to burn the whole thing up, which he's going to do, but he's not going to ever send another global flood. And so God can limit his omnipotence. That's not a power that's beyond his capability to do. In fact, a God that could not limit his own omnipotence, you would say, would be less powerful, which is an impossibility because there cannot be less powerful and still be all-powerful. All right, let's flip the paper over and talk about a couple other things relating to atheism or agnosticism. One of the major factors that you find within atheism is there's a lot of times a viewpoint of determinism, which is essentially a rejection of the idea of free will. When you woke up this morning and you looked into your cabinet and you decided whether you're going to eat cornflakes or you're going to eat Wheaties, you thought you had a decision to make. You thought you were making a free will choice, and you reached out there and you grabbed Wheaties. But if we had made a copy of the universe right before you did that, and we made 1 million copies and we had them all play out and you had the free will choice every time, you would have picked the same cereal box every time. You thought you had a free will choice, but really it was a combination of everything that had hit you up to this point that just bent you in the right way, and you thought you had free will, but you're really a machine, and you would have picked the same thing. And that's the idea of determinism. Everything, kind of the same idea that is triggered by the cosmological argument, right? The idea that everything has a cause, and so things don't happen because of uncaused reasons. The cosmological argument posits, of course, that a spirit like God is outside of that cause chain, And human beings also have a spirit, so we can make decisions that seemingly have no causes. But determinism says, no, everything is forced in. You did something just because everything lined up in the past to make it so. But there's a good argument against determinism. And the argument against it is the fact that it's self-refuting. According to J.R. Lucas, if what the determinist says is true, that is, if determinism is true, he says it merely as a result of his heredity and environment and of nothing else. He does not hold his determinist views because they are true, but because he has had such and such stimuli. That is not because the structure of the universe is such and such, but only because the configuration of only part of the universe, together with the structure of the determinist brain, is such as to produce that result. Determinism, therefore, cannot be true, because if it was, we should not take the determinist arguments as being really arguments, but as being only conditioned reflexes. Their statements should not be regarded as really claiming to be true, but only as seeking us to respond in some way desired by them. Now, if you didn't follow that all the way through, here's what it's saying. If everything that we do is simply a result of our programming, and we had no choice to do so otherwise, then the very determinist who states determinism is true is only stating it to be true because he's been programmed to do so. When he says the world is a determinist function, well, yeah, but you would say that because you have no choice but to say that. I should not view you stating determinism as true as being a real argument because you had no free will to say anything else. You've been forced to say determinism is true. And so anybody who claims determinism is true is themselves, in their own viewpoint, just stating something because of their environment and the things that played on them to force them into saying such a thing. And so determinism in that sense is self-refuting because if determinism really is true, we shouldn't believe the determinist who espouses it. Kind of a weird thing there. The same argument can be used against the Calvinist opposition to free will, by the way. All right, and then one other thing that I'm going to discuss just before we close here is the new atheism. This is mostly a product of the last 50 years or so. Richard Dawkins is a main person within new atheism. And here's what he says. I lately started to think that we need to go further, beyond humorous ridicule, sharpen our barbs to a point where they really hurt. I think we should probably abandon the irremediably religious precisely because that is what they are, irremediable. I am more interested in the fence-sitters who haven't really considered the question very long or very carefully. And I think that they are likely to be swayed by a display of naked contempt. Nobody likes to be laughed at. Nobody wants to be the butt of contempt. And Graham Veal says, this is a guy who's written a pretty good book. I listed the book there in case you're interested to purchase it. It has some really good stuff in it. The new atheist is not interested in calm reflection or rational thought. Media-savvy atheists are now targeting a younger, more cynical market. Their aim is to sell a sense of intellectual superiority at a low intellectual price. And it is working. New atheist material needs no knowledge of or interest in history or philosophy or even science. Anecdotal evidence and quips replace sound arguments. Now, if any of you have spent any time, and I hope not for your own sakes because it's not a fun place to be, but if you spend any time looking at atheist forums or websites on the internet today, you'll notice that it's not really as much a bastion of sound logical reasoning. Now, as I mentioned, your older generation of atheists are people who very much, they're into the sound logic and reasoning. But the generation that's coming up today, and have no doubt about it, there's going to be a very sizable percentage of this country that are going to be atheists, just based on what's coming out of our schools. They have not been reasoned to the point of atheism by discussing the arguments and finding, after a long and tedious study, that the God theory just doesn't hold water. No, they've fallen prone to the fact that it's just not in vogue to be a Christian, and that if you try to say, you believe in creation, that people like Richard Dawkins and those that he has trained with his books, they'll come out with just contempt against you. And as he said, truthfully, nobody likes to be the person that everybody views with contempt. Nobody wants to be the person everybody says is stupid. And so when everybody is saying a specific viewpoint, like believing in God, is stupid, even though they've presented no argument for it, and there's some pretty intellectual arguments to discuss against it, they're turning people with that kind of a thing. And you notice, just like the atheist Facebook memes, I could spend hours if I wanted to. Actually, I don't even use Facebook, but I could go on there and try to refute each one. But nobody cares to read a long response to the meme. The meme was not there to try to demonstrate the positive proof of no God anyway. It was there to simply ridicule, to make the Christian or the theist, to make them look stupid. And so it works. But realize this is kind of what we're dealing with now with the younger generation coming up. It's a low intellectual price. You just say you're an atheist and everybody says, oh, there's an intelligent guy, right? That's the idea that they're trying to push for. And so we need to be aware of that. And we need to not fall into it because in response, I've seen an awful lot of theist or Christian materials or books that are just as caustic and non-intellectual, and that doesn't create something positive to bring people toward the truth when they look at that material and say, it falls right into their trap because they point Christians as being stupid and silly, and so if our material is just as bad as theirs, then in fact they have a point to make, and it really is stupid and silly. So these are philosophical arguments, and really this is pretty much the only time so far in this class that I've delved into philosophy. It's not a good thing in for most of your Christian experience to be messing with a whole lot of philosophy. There are certain philosophical systems, even within Christianity, where people just get bogged down into deep things that are really beyond what the Bible is even talking about, but there is sometimes a proper place for it, and that's why I presented it here. And there are plenty of other things that you can also use to discuss with an atheist. There's questions of meaning. Does life really have any ultimate purpose? There's things like Pascal's wager, which I would like to discuss at some point, but just don't have the time today to discuss it. Some of these are interesting, and if the question of atheism or agnosticism is something that you're interested in, or if you want to hear more about things like deism, or answering the questions of like the flying spaghetti monster, which is an atheist argument, which actually I think is a pretty good argument, but we do have to dissect it quite a bit. That's stuff that I cover in my atheism class. I have recorded it in the past, and so if you're interested in seeing some of those videos, I could try to dig those up as well. But there's a lot to be said to the atheists. We certainly should not be afraid of what they have to say. Every argument that they've posited, there's nothing new under the sun. There's generally some kind of a Christian apologist 200 years ago who wrote a book against that argument, right? And nowadays the thing is nobody's going back and reading them. But these arguments are not new, they're not unique, and we do have responses, and Christianity can certainly stand up against the arguments of atheists and agnostics. And agnostics. And agnostics. And agnostics. And agnostics. And agnostics.